Today we're going to talk about the Porfiriato, a 31-year period where Porfirio Diaz was a dictator, elected to the presidency 7 times, and we're going to talk about his vision for the country. Who was Porfirio Diaz? He was a hero at the time that he was elected for the first time. He was a Mexican general. He had been a leader against the French intervention and had gained a lot of attention for his leading the fight against the Emperor Maximilian, who was imposed on Mexico by Napoleon. So he was beloved at the time that he was elected president. I'm sure that many of you have seen as you're driving to UTEP on I-10 West that there is a street called Porfirio Diaz. And people often ask me, why do we have a street in El Paso named after a dictator? Well, Porfirio Diaz Street leads into Sunset Heights. When Porfirio Diaz was exiled from Mexico in 1911 as a result of the Mexican Revolution, many of his followers, wealthy people, came to El Paso and moved into Sunset Heights. And that's why there's a street honoring a dictator in El Paso. What was the Porfiriato? It is a time when Mexico becomes more quote-unquote modern, which is what Diaz wanted. It became a nation that didn't just import goods, but also exported goods, especially to the United States. It was a nation that had foreign investment, especially from the United States and Great Britain. During the Porfiriato, healthcare improved and education somewhat improved. Porfirio Diaz wanted law and progress for Mexico. The law part meant a very strong control of the people in order for him to remain in power. He was a general, so he understood the importance of the military and the power of the military. When he became president, he reduced the military so there would be less chance of the military deposing him, and he instead depended on the rural police to keep peace, the Porfirian peace, which meant that people had very little freedom. But there were rebellions against him in the 1890s in the state of Chihuahua, for example, and there were people organizing against his dictatorship, like the Flores Magón brothers that I'll talk about later. And when we talk about the progress part, progress was really economic progress for his circle, for the Mexican elites, and definitely progress and profit for foreign investors. Diaz is alleged to have said, "Poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to the United States." So close to the United States that had taken half of Mexican territory in 1848. But ironically, Diaz welcomed American investors and they became very powerful, especially in the Mexican North, investing in railroads and in mining. Mexico, like the United States, was an agricultural nation in the 19th century. Both countries had many small farms. In Mexico, subsistence farmers grew the staples, beans, corn, chile, in order to keep their families alive. There was very little export of agricultural goods. Under the Porfiriato, under this plan of modernization, agriculture changed. Land laws were revised so that land that had been owned communally by villages became private land, and haciendas became huge as they took over land that had been previously farmed by subsistence farmers. Because Porfirio Diaz wanted the the country to be an exporter of agricultural goods. Rather than people growing the staples that they needed to live, the beans and the corn especially, haciendas that took over these small subsistence farms began to grow coffee and henequen, which you can see on this photo. Henequen is used to make ropes. Coffee and henequen became two major exports of Mexico. So let's think about what this means. By taking land out of production for the staples that people need to eat, there are fewer beans, there is less corn. What does that do to the price of those staples? It makes them go up. At the same time that people are losing their small farms, they're being pushed into the wage economy because they can no longer just grow what they need in order to survive. So the price of food is going up. More people are looking for wage jobs. And what does that do to wages? It makes wages go down. So lower wages, higher prices. This was the modernization of agriculture. One especially horrific thing that Diaz did is he enslaved the Yaqui people from Sonora and sent them to Yucatan to work on these henequen plantations. Some of the Yaqui crossed the border into Arizona to escape enslavement, which is why in Tucson, for example, we have a Yaqui reservation. I mentioned a few minutes ago that as part of the modernization, healthcare improved and education improved. With an improvement in healthcare, fewer people died. So this adds to that dynamic that I was talking about. There are more people looking for work. There are more people in general. The price of food is going up and wages are going down. So the social implications for this modernization was that the poor were suffering. Modernization was at the expense of the lives of the poor, while bringing great profits to landowners, the hacendados, who owned huge numbers of acres, and foreign investors. What made this possible? Railroads. Railroads that reached both sides of the border in Ciudad Juárez and El Paso in the 1880s made possible the transport of export goods, but also of workers. Workers going from central and southern Mexico to the border, to the north of Mexico where wages were higher, and eventually Mexican workers to the United States. So goods could travel more easily and people could travel more easily. Railroads were very, very profitable. The main investors in Mexican railroads were the United States and Great Britain. Porfirio Diaz welcomed foreign investment because he believed that the only way for Mexico to modernize economically was to become a place where other nations invested money. Because foreign investors were welcomed into Mexico, you have U.S. businessmen becoming very, very influential, very powerful, especially in the Mexican North. This photo is a photo of General Green, who owned the mines at Cananea, Sonora, talking to his workers who were on strike. Very powerful American businessmen in the Mexican North began to control the economy of northern Mexico. Modernization then brings foreign investment, and in many ways Mexico really starts to lose control of the economy in the north, and the profits are coming to the United States rather than staying in Mexico. Have you seen this image of the sleeping Mexican? If you've ever gone to any of the curio shops in Juarez, you see it all the time. The one that does not make sense to me is the one where the man is sleeping against a cactus. So I tried to find one where there was no cactus. But this image that we just think of as a tourist kind of image, and that may offend us, the sleeping Mexican, is actually an image that comes from the Porfiriato, and it doesn't represent just a sleeping Mexican. It represents a homeless, rural person who has come to the city to look for work and is on the streets. So when you see this, think about the suffering of the poor people during the Porfiriato. Just to sum this up, modernization worked in that Mexico became an exporter. Foreign investors invested heavily in Mexico, especially in railroads and mining. The wealth of Mexico went up, but the wealth was in the hands of very few. So modernization was successful, but on the backs of the poor. This is going to lay the foundation for the Mexican Revolution. The tremendous suffering of the poor, along with the fact that the middle class in Mexico, which is still quite small in this time period, has no political power. Political power is in the hands of the elite. Remember, the Porfiriato lays the foundation for the Mexican Revolution of 1910 to 1920.